water wasn't water. It was liquid darkness, liquid possibility, liquid truth. As I sank into its depths, I felt the house's connection to my blood beginning to fray like an old rope under too much weight. The entity rose to meet me, its form shifting and changing, becoming something that my mind could almost, but not quite, comprehend. The binding breaks, it said, and I felt the words as much as heard them, vibrating through my bones and into my soul. The prison crumbles, the false world ends, but something new begins. Above us, the house was screaming, not metaphorically, literally screaming, a sound like every piece of wood and metal and stone crying out in agony. The guardians were reaching into the pool, their keys blazing with desperate light, trying to maintain their connection to the bloodline that had sustained them for over a century. But I was already beyond their reach, sinking deeper into the darkness, feeling my humanity dissolving like sugar in water. I was becoming something else, something that existed in the spaces between thoughts, between heartbeats, between the moments when reality decided what it wanted to be. The 13th step, the entity said, and now its voice was merging with mine, our consciousness beginning to blend. The step that doesn't exist, the step that is the only one that matters. The pool erupted around us. I surfaced in a world that was simultaneously exactly the same and completely different. I was still in the basement of the house on Millbrook Lane, but the basement was now a vast cathedral of impossible architecture, its ceiling lost in shadows that pulsed with their own inner light. The 7 stone pillars had become trees, not any trees that existed in Earth's reality, but things of crystalline bark and leaves that sang with voices I almost recognized. The entity was beside me, its form now stable enough for me to perceive directly. It looked like a constellation arranged in roughly human proportions, stars and nebulae and cosmic dust forming the suggestion of arms, legs, a face that shifted between familiar and utterly alien. Welcome to the true world, it said, its voice now the sound of galaxies being born. Or rather, welcome to the world as it chooses to be moment by moment, without the constraints your ancestor imposed upon it. I looked down at my hands and saw that they were translucent, shot through with veins of light that pulsed in rhythm with my heartbeat. I was still human, but human in the way that water is still water when it becomes ice, the same substance, but existing in a fundamentally different state. What happened to the house? Look up! I raised my eyes and saw the guardians suspended in the air above us, frozen in the moment of their reaching toward the pool. But they were changing, their forms becoming more solid, more real, as the house's artificial sustenance was replaced by something more fundamental. Eleanor was the first to complete the transformation. She dropped from the air, landing on the crystalline floor with a sound like breaking glass. But when she looked up, her eyes were clear for the first time in over a century. I remember, she said, her voice filled with wonder and something that might have been tears. I remember being alive, really alive, not just sustained by hunger. The other guardians were following suit, each one rediscovering their humanity as the binding that had held them dissolved like morning mist. Uncle Cornelius materialized beside me, solid and real and looking exactly as he had in life. You did it, he said, his voice thick with emotion. You broke the chain. You freed us all. What about the world above? I asked, suddenly terrified of what I might have unleashed. What about all the people who don't know what's happening? They're discovering it now, the entity said, its cosmic voice somehow gentle. The dissolution of the false reality doesn't happen all at once. It spreads outward from the epicenter, giving consciousness time to adapt. Your species is more resilient than you know. Through the basement's walls, which were now transparent, showing the house's interior in cross-section like a dollhouse, I could see the transformation spreading. The impossible rooms were becoming possible, the twisted corridors straightening into logical paths. The portraits on the walls were stepping down from their frames, becoming real people again, blinking in confusion as they remembered lives they'd thought were dreams. The house was a tumor, Eleanor said, understanding dawning in her expression like sunrise. A growth that had convinced itself it was the entire body. But now that it's been removed, the body can heal, I finished. Reality can remember what it was before the binding. We climbed the stairs together, all of us, the former guardians, and the entity and me. The staircase was still there, but it was no longer impossible. It was just stairs, leading from one floor to another, each step solid and real, and exactly where it should be. The foyer was bright with natural light streaming through windows that now showed the true world outside. I could see the town of Millbrook, but it was different. The buildings were more organic, growing from the earth like living things. The people in the streets were moving differently, more fluidly, as if the rigid laws of physics had become suggestions rather than absolute commands. Is it better? I asked the entity. This new world? It's truer, it replied, its stellar form shimmering in the sunlight. Whether it's better depends on what you value. There will be less certainty, less predictability, but there will also be less limitation, less artificial constraint. Consciousness will be free to explore its full potential. I walked to the front door and opened it. The air outside smelled of possibilities, not the familiar sense of grass and flowers and exhaust fumes, but something new, something that had never existed in the old world. The sky was a deeper blue, shot through with colors that had no names, and the clouds moved in patterns that suggested intelligence rather than mere atmospheric pressure. What happens to us now? I asked. You live, the entity said simply. All of you. The guardians are free to discover what they would have become if they'd never been bound. The house's victims are free to remember their lives. And you? I'm the last of the Blackwoods, I said, the weight of generations finally lifting from my shoulders. In the old world, that would have meant something. But in this world, you're simply Margaret, Uncle Cornelius said, putting a hand on my shoulder that felt warm and real and alive. Free to choose your own path, your own identity, your own meaning. The bloodline ends with you, but you begin with yourself. I stepped out onto the porch, and the wooden boards beneath my feet felt solid and real, in a way that the house's floors never had. I was no longer bound by the accumulated weight of my family's history, no longer constrained by the roles and expectations that had been built into my very DNA. Behind me, the house was transforming one final time. The Victorian facade was melting away like ice in summer sun, revealing something simpler, more honest, a home that existed to shelter rather than to contain, to nurture rather than to feed. The symbol into the woodwork were becoming flowers, the twisted angles straightening into comfortable proportions. "Will you stay?" Eleanor asked, her voice carrying none of the hunger that had defined her for so long. The house could use a caretaker, someone to help it remember how to be what it was meant to be. I considered the offer. The house was beautiful now, peaceful, free of the malevolent intelligence that had driven it for over a century. It would be easy to stay, to make a life here in this new world where the boundaries between possible and impossible had blurred beyond recognition. But as I looked down the street toward the town, toward the people who were discovering their own freedom, I felt the pull of adventure, of discovery, of all the things I'd never been able to pursue while bound by my family's legacy. "I think I'll explore," I said, surprising myself with how certain I felt. This new world is full of possibilities, and I've spent too much of my life living in the shadow of the past. I walked down the steps, away from the house, away from the guardians, away from the entity that had helped me break the binding. With each step, I felt lighter, freer, more myself than I'd ever been. The world around me shimmered with potential. I could see it now, the way reality bent and flowed according to will and need rather than rigid physical laws. A child's laughter made flowers bloom from concrete. An old man's memories of his wife created butterflies that danced around his shoulders. The very air sparkled with the dreams and hopes of people finally free to imagine new possibilities. Behind me, the house settled into its new existence with a sound like a contented sigh. The guardians were dispersing, each one choosing their own path now that they were free to choose. Eleanor had decided to stay after all, but not as a warden, as a teacher, helping others understand what it meant to live without the constraints of the old reality. Uncle Cornelius caught up with me at the end of the street. "You're really leaving?" "For now," I said. "But I'll be back. This place, this house, it's part of me, part of my story. But it's not the end of my story anymore." He smiled, and in that expression I saw not the tired, haunted man I'd known, but the person he might have been if he'd never been trapped by duty and obligation. "The world is going to need guides," he said, "people who understand both what was and what could be. When you're ready, I'll know where to find you," I finished. The sun was setting now, painting the sky in colors that had never existed before today. In the distance, I could hear music, not any instruments I recognized, but something that spoke directly to the soul. People were coming out of their houses, stepping into the streets, looking around with wonder at a world that had suddenly become infinite with possibility. I pulled out my phone to stop the recording, then realized it was no longer just a phone. In this new reality, it had become something else, a device that could capture not just sound and image, but emotion, memory, the very essence of experience. "This is Margaret Blackwood," I said into it, watching as my words took on a life of their own, becoming visible in the air like golden threads. Final update from Millbrook Lane. The house is free, the guardians are free, and if you're listening to this recording, it means the world has changed. I looked back one last time at the house on Millbrook Lane, now glowing softly in the twilight like a lantern in the darkness. If you ever find yourself inheriting something that feels too terrible to be real, remember this: you always have a choice. The difficult part isn't making the choice, it's being brave enough to live with the consequences. But sometimes the consequences of courage are more beautiful than we could ever imagine. I turned off the recording and walked into the new world, ready to discover what it meant to be truly free.
1 month later, I received a letter, not through any postal service, but delivered by a bird made of starlight that perched on my windowsill until I took the envelope from its beak.
Margaret, it read in handwriting that changed styles with each word. There are others like you, others who were bound by their family's choices, their ancestors' mistakes, their inherited obligations. They're finding their way to places like Millbrook, drawn by the same force that called you home. They need guidance, understanding, someone who has walked the path they're walking. The house misses you. Eleanor has turned the basement into a sanctuary for those learning to navigate the new reality. The entity you freed has become a teacher, helping people understand that what they once called impossible was simply undiscovered. But most importantly, the world is healing. The false constraints are dissolving everywhere, and people are remembering how to dream again. When you're ready to come home, not as a guardian, but as a guide, we'll be here. With love and infinite possibility, Uncle Cornelius.